So ever since the release of Clair Obscur Expedition 33, there has been a conversation that has been persistently popping up on my feed, mainly due to, I think, one content creator in particular by the name of Sebby Webs, who is talking about fixing modern-day Final Fantasy, and that has caused quite a number of different reactions across the whole of the platform, and I figured I'd go ahead and give my 2 cents into it as someone who has been a pretty huge and consummate fan of the series since I was a kid. So I think what needs to be understood most, and where we need to kind of figure out why Final Fantasy is in the situation that it is, regardless of whether or not I enjoy most of the modern day Final Fantasy games, I can at the very least say with my whole heart that as fun as they have been, there is still a fundamental problem with the games, and that just so happens to be that it is suffering from one of the most massive identity crises I think a game has suffered from quite some time. So back in the day, when you would play a Final Fantasy title, any title that could be potentially before 12, you could 100% see a lot of the Japanese influence pretty much through and through. But ever since a particular moment in Final Fantasy history, things have been wildly different. Do you remember what that moment is? A lot of you probably do, but you haven't really thought about it in a very long time. Do the words Fabula Nova Crystallis mean anything to you? For those of you who are kind of new Final Fantasy heads that have sort of been showing up to play either the remake trilogy, 15 or 16, you're probably not super aware of what the Fabula Nova Crystallis series actually is. So let me kind of break it down for you. So somewhere around 2005 or 6, it was announced during one of the E3s that Square Enix was trying to do something new with the Final Fantasy franchise. For their next mainline iteration of Final Fantasy, they were going to try to create something known as the Fabula Nova Crystallis series. And what this was a series of not one, not two, but 3 separate titles that would all kind of take place in similar universes. Not necessarily the same universe, but they would all basically be pulling from the same sort of mythology, utilizing the same sort of themes, and that was what they were trying to tout as the future of Final Fantasy for a very long time. Those 3 games just so happen to be Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy XIII Versus, and Final Fantasy Agito. Now, Final Fantasy XIII had a storyline that ultimately ended up needing to expand itself towards 3 other entries, which is why we got 13-2 and Lightning Returns. Then, Final Fantasy XIII Versus was caught in what one could only surmise as a infinite dev hell, until finally, whatever was left from the scraps of that weirdo experiment gone wrong actually ended up becoming Final Fantasy XV, which is also possibly one of the most polarizing entries in the series. That is up until Final Fantasy XVI came out and basically was nothing more than just a traditional action game with little to no RPG elements. And finally, Final Fantasy Agito, which I think actually did release in 2 capacities. If I remember correctly, there was a Final Fantasy Agito that was strictly a mobile game that was some kind of card game that just sort of got canceled and instead became what we knew as Type 0. Both Final Fantasy XV and Type 0 were directed specifically by Hajime Tabata, who had worked on some previous projects before. One of them just so happened to be Third Birthday. So, could probably put into perspective just why the 2 games that he worked on were not necessarily the best, but fun in the grand scheme of things, you know? But yeah, so factor all of this sort of kind of going tits up for Square Enix, on top of the fact that they were simultaneously creating Final Fantasy 1.0 for 14, that almost literally bankrupted the company. Square Enix has been floundering, trying its best to do everything in its power to try to sell Final Fantasy as a franchise that is more worldwide, and less as one that's going to be appealing purely to Japanese audiences. Now, granted, ever since Final Fantasy VII, they have always tried to create larger-than-life AAA projects that were trying to get more worldwide appeal. However, they were always the ones that were the trendsetters, and it just so happened that they, alongside another couple of other Japanese companies, when they were transitioning over to the HD era, they just didn't really know how else to do it. And that's why we see a lot of Xbox 360 and PS3 titles from a lot of different developers that we know are kind of in a weird spot. Capcom also suffer from this actually a lot, believe it or not, which is why we also get to see Dead Rising 2, DMC, and Lost Planet 3 all be games that were effectively outsourced to Western studios as opposed to actually being made in-house, because they were trying to find a way to kind of re-get the money that they had all basically spent on Resident Evil 6, which at the time I think was considered somewhat of a commercial failure, but that ended up kind of fixing itself in the grand scheme of things. Regardless, Final Fantasy was just not in a very great place ever since then, which is why we saw them do so many different things with 15. And 15 had this massive multimedia approach. It had the movie that was created for it, the anime series that was created for it, a number of different other things. Like, I think there was like 1 or 2 mobile games that were released for it as well. They tried to make Final Fantasy 15 the best, biggest, and largest in the entire franchise, and by their own metric, they fundamentally failed. Now, I think at this point, they've at least sold $10 million, or not $10 million, I'm sorry, 10 million units, which was able to get them kind of to recoup their losses a little bit. But that was over the course of like up until now. And I think that there's, if I remember correctly, Final Fantasy 15 definitely has a little bit over 10 million units right now, but it was considered a huge fundamental failure even at 6 million units sold. So there's also kind of a weird thing with Square Enix numbers where no one really knows what their real internal metrics are, because for one reason or another, they'll sell upwards of 5 to 7 to 8 to sometimes 10 million copies of a title and consider it a fundamental failure. I think 16, unfortunately, is the only one that has actively been more of a failure than anything right now. I don't know if that game has eclipsed or gone past 5 million units last I checked. I have to go ahead and take a look. Let me go ahead and see real quick. Yeah, apparently, according to a lot of sources, even ones from 2025, they have only sold 3.5 million units, which for a Final Fantasy mainline franchise game is a massive failure by their own internal metrics, which really sucks. But it also makes a lot of sense because, unfortunately, as much as I did like Final Fantasy 16, it does have a lot of problems. So now that we kind of understood that, what exactly is it that they're sort of floundering about? Well, it's not necessarily that they're not turn-based anymore. It's more that they don't necessarily know which audience they want to attract anymore, because clearly there are now 2 separate audiences that we've created. There are people who really enjoy the modern games like Final Fantasy 15, 16, and the new Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, which is all doing relatively well, all things considered, but a large majority of people basically would line up and buy a whole new Final Fantasy game if it was, turn-based. So I've got an idea for them. Metaphor, Yakuza, and the Legend of Heroes series are all relatively successful JRPGs that are all doing relatively well for themselves, including Clair Obscur right now, which is a RPG inspired by JRPGs, and I would call each of these systems to be utilizing something known as a hybrid turn-based combat system. Now, for Clair Obscur, it's a little bit less in that range. It's just more that there's a lot more action-like elements being introduced into your turn-based game. But things like Metaphor and Legend of Heroes are the ones that I'm really talking about. So in Legend of Heroes and Metaphor, you can utilize turn-based combat after you sort of engage with it with the real-time counter by hitting somebody for a little bit, and then there's like a stun button, and when they find themselves stunned, you press another button to engage in turn-based combat, and that allows you to sort of have a kind of like preemptive bonus at the beginning of every single round. This has been working really well. Metaphor has just recently cleared 2 million units, and the Legend of Heroes series, people really do like that. And the Yakuza series, of course, is another amazing AAA game series that is working really well. So if you want to capture the imagination and the love of both the old heads and the new, invest in a turn-based system that is hybrid. Go ahead and do it. I gave you the idea. I think that right now, FF17 must be in some phase in pre-production at some point. So 100% they're thinking about this. They're 100% thinking about doing something of that in that vein. So that's what I think is the real idea here. I also don't think that they're not just looking at their other games right now and sort of just letting them fall to the wayside. FF7 Rebirth has probably one of the best realized JRPG worlds I think I've seen in a very long time. It just so happened to be bogged down with a lot of other menial shit that no one really cares about. A lot of stupid Ubisoft objectives that ultimately hold the game back from being the true, honest-to-God magnum opus of a JRPG that it can be. It's still a really fundamentally great game, and I think a lot of people would agree if maybe they removed some of that shit and also added more of a hybrid combat system. So what you need to expand on the world building and overall world creation and combine it with the hybrid combat system, and you would probably have what is most assuredly going to be the most successful Final Fantasy game of all time. I can promise you that. Anyways, what about you guys? What do you think? Is Final Fantasy a long gone and dead series for you, or do you think that they can win you back if they decide to go ahead and do either turn-based or even a hybrid turn-based combat system like I'm talking about? Let me know in the comments. Y'all have a good one. Like, favorite, follow. Appreciate you. And comment.